Hey, now that you've read the RUSA guidelines for behavioral performance, I wanted to make a few comments about these guidelines. First of all, I think that they are a really good example of what a professional organization can do to contribute to the profession as a whole. We talked about that a little bit on the first day of class, and so now here's a really good example. Reference librarians have worked very hard for years to put together these guidelines and to revise them. I think there have been several revisions. So that's a pretty neat thing to think about. These guidelines are pretty standard, and are used in libraries throughout the country. On the other hand, we do need to think about who it is who puts together these guidelines, who's the committee that writes them. I don't always completely agree with them, and I'm not sure how much they consult researchers who are doing cutting-edge research in reference and information services when they put together these guidelines. One of my criticisms of the guidelines is that they are behavioral, and they clearly state that they are, but I think there's a lot of other things that we need to consider, not just behaviors. So, of course, in this class I'm always talking about tensions and different ways of thinking about things, so you do have to look at these guidelines that are formed by a committee, and who's on the committee, and how much influence and power should they have over the work that you do. Although I think in general these are really great guidelines. So let me tell you about one other just slightly different approach to this idea of the reference interview, and then we're going to talk about the different parts. So I wanted to tell you about the Maryland model for the reference interview, I think they call it. Most people just say the Maryland model. I believe that the Maryland model is where the idea for the 5 steps of these RUSA behavioral guidelines came from. I don't know that for sure, but I'm assuming there's a strong connection. The Maryland model was developed years ago in reaction to a study that said that something like 55% of all reference questions are answered incorrectly. And you've probably heard of this study. I'll see if I can't find a couple of citations about this debate. It's quite a debate that's gone on for decades. But the idea is that there was this discovery that many questions were not answered correctly, and so the Maryland library system decided they had to do something about this. And they did a lot of research and a lot of thinking and came up with a model for the reference interview that would help people get their answers right when they worked with patrons. And you have to think about this model. It's it's a lot like the RUSA guidelines. So the steps are the same. It's just very strict. For example, in the inquiring stage, listening inquiring stage, staff were told that they had to ask 2 open-ended questions. They always had to ask at least 2, and they had to be open-ended. And that's very strict. And one other strict thing was the follow-up question. They always had to say, does this completely answer your question? And that was always what every staff member had to say to follow the model correctly. Now, I think that the RUSA guidelines are a lot more open and more general, and that's good, because you never know really what you're going to come up with in a reference interaction. But the Maryland model was very strict because it was supposed to be used by staff. And I think about you with all of your context you're getting from getting this professional degree, and you're going through this whole class, and plus you're going to have other classes that are going to reinforce and strengthen the things that you learn with me. But if you hire a staff member who has no background in libraries, they also have to be able to answer questions correctly. So the Maryland model was really strict about what they were supposed to be able to do in order to get these questions correct. Now, one of the great things about the Maryland model, possibly that it gave birth to the RUSA guidelines, but also there's a component called technical feedback. And in order to learn to do reference, you can't just learn the model, but you have to go and practice the model. And so you were supposed to go and do your reference work according to the model, and then have someone observe you, a peer observe you, and give you technical feedback about how you had done. So they would not say, you really did not look approachable, but they would say things like, I noticed that you smiled several times during the interaction. You would say, okay, good, so that's what I was aiming for. Or they might say, every time the user said something, you winced. And then you can think, oh gosh, I didn't realize I winced every time the user spoke. And so then that was something that you could work on. And you would set goals and have people come and watch you again. But the idea was that the feedback was not supposed to be critical or evaluative, but technical, just telling you what you did and what you said. This is a very, very useful way of giving feedback. You are definitely going to have to be giving feedback to peers, to students that you hire, to your librarians who work for you, all sorts of people. And so knowing that skill of technical feedback can be very, very useful. Even if you have to evaluate people eventually, giving them some technical feedback can at least give them the chance to improve before you start telling them they're not doing very well at something. So let's see, let's talk about the elements, 5 elements real quickly. With approachability, I just want to make really clear that no one is saying that to be a good reference service provider you have to have a Burger King smile plastered across your face. This is not really customer service, it's just that you need to be approachable enough that you're not making the information problem worse for your user than it was before they came. So thinking about the Kuhlthau's, affective aspects of the reference experience, you want to make sure that the user feels welcome, that the user feels as comfortable as possible, so they can trust you and start to talk to you about their need. This is really challenging to do in digital reference because they can't see the smile on your face, they can't see the interest in your eyes, so you have to come up with ways to seem approachable in digital reference as well. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in a couple of weeks. I think that interest is a really interesting category, category to include, but again, it kind of goes with approachability, but if you can find a way to show some interest in a user's question, if you are interested in their question, you can just say, oh, that's a really interesting question. And again, the affective benefits to the user, if they suddenly feel sort of proud of their research, proud of their question, good about what they're doing, they're going to be a lot more engaged and successful in the process. Not all questions are really interesting at first. If you get your 7th question of the day about global warming, you really can't say, oh, that's a really interesting question. But as you start to say, well, tell me a little bit more about what you're doing with global warming. Maybe you'll find some aspect that's interesting. You might say, oh, well, if you're really interested in how global warming affects kids that are already starving in third world countries, that's a really interesting aspect of the question that I hadn't thought of before. And suddenly the user feels good about their research. Again, use closed and open questions. Despite the Maryland model saying you have to use 2 open-ended questions, you definitely want to use a combination. Sometimes you need to zero in on what the user really needs and clarify what you have learned. The next section on searching, we talked about searching a lot in the last couple weeks, so we're not going to focus on that for the next few weeks. We're focusing on kind of the other parts of the model. But keep in mind, too, the focus of the RUSA guidelines on searching for information, so information retrieval. There's not a lot of mention about teaching and teaching strategies. They're kind of focusing on more information gathering kind of interactions, I think. And then finally, the follow-up. And this is a really important part of the interaction because it's your chance to recover if you didn't really do what the user needed you to do. The Maryland model, of course, has that really strict question. Did this completely answer your question? And of course, in my work, I never completely answered the question because it wasn't going to be answered till the user had finished writing their dissertation, for example. But I tried to be still concrete in some way. So I could say, well, if you don't find that book on the shelf, come back and get me and I will help you find it. And I once had a user turn to me and say, oh, you really care if I find this book, don't you? And I remember thinking, well, of course I care, or I wouldn't be here. But the user didn't realize that. I guess the user just thought this was some job and it was a stupid question and I wouldn't care. So that was an effective follow-up with that user from a customer service standpoint. But I would also say things like to an undergraduate, I might say, if you don't find the 3 articles you need for this paper in the next 15 minutes, come back and get me, and I will help you some more. Because I heard so many times users say, I've been searching for 2 hours and I haven't found anything. And I just thought, I never want someone to take my advice and go work for 2 hours and still not get anywhere. I mean, what a waste of their life. So I would give them this really short, maybe unrealistically short amount of time to get something done. But at least then, if they completely forgot what I had to say, they could come back in 15 minutes and say, could you show me that again? So I did try and be really concrete in my invitation for people to return and ask me a question. Sometimes people will just say, okay, if you need anything else, just let me know. And at least that's fine too. At least it's an invitation to come back. At least it shows that you cared about the question.